The twin suns of Virexus Prime hovered above the crystalline dome of the Galactic Academy, casting shimmering patterns over its spires and floating lecture halls. From orbit, the Academy looked like a celestial brain, each neuron a hub of advanced alien intellect, each synapse a pathway between thousands of species exchanging culture, knowledge, and tradition. For centuries, it had been the beacon of higher arts, attracting students from across galaxies. But in all those centuries, no human had ever stepped foot on its ceremonial stage. Until now. David stood alone at the base of the Rotunda of Expression, clutching a small datapad with sweaty palms. He was 22 Earth years old, tall and lean, with eyes that carried the weight of countless forgotten stories. The clothes he wore, simple compared to the elaborate robes and kinetic ornaments of his alien peers, clung to him like a protective layer against the overwhelming grandeur of the Academy. Around him swirled languages he barely understood, some spoken, some sung, others projected directly into the mind. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place where creativity had been perfected, engineered, and enhanced beyond emotional need. Yet he was. The class he had been assigned to, Narrative Constructs and Multi-Method Resonance, was led by none other than Professor Xylar of the Thavari Ascendancy. Xylar was a floating being of shimmering light, encased in a translucent exosuit that clicked with every movement. Her voice vibrated directly into the nervous system of her students, calibrated for maximum cognitive retention. She had been awarded the Galaxis Medal for Cognitive Design after creating a narrative so logically flawless it caused 3 attending species to enter permanent states of enlightened contemplation. She didn't like improvisation. She didn't like emotional messiness. Most of all, she didn't like Earthlings. The moment David entered the hall, late due to an orbital shuttle delay, Xylar's glow dimmed. Her optics scanned him from head to toe, noting the outdated interface on his pad, the lack of neural enhancements in his cortex, and the unmodulated, natural pitch of his voice when he muttered an apology. "You must be the human," she said coldly, using Galactic Standard. "I had hoped the administrative error would be rectified before term began." David blinked, unsure whether to respond or pretend he hadn't heard. His voice wavered slightly. "Yes, I'm David Harper. From Earth." A titter of amusement rippled through the class. A Clavathi with 4 eyes and a crown of living vines whispered something that made the luminescent creature beside him smirk and shift its shape in silent mockery. David tried not to flinch. He reminded himself why he was here, because storytelling mattered to him, even if no one else in this room understood it the same way. Xylar gestured toward the center platform with one long, jointless arm. "Since you have interrupted our session, Mr. Harper, let us assess your potential immediately. You will perform a short tale, 5 minutes. Any format you desire. Impress us." David froze. He hadn't prepared anything. He hadn't even settled into his dorm pod, let alone reviewed the syllabi. But backing down now would only confirm their assumptions. So, he stepped forward, letting the silence of expectation fall heavy on his shoulders. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and began. "I want to tell you a story about a boy who waited." He spoke plainly, without holograms or audio effects. Just the cadence of his voice and the sincerity in his words. It was a fragment of a tale his grandfather had once told him. A story about a child who waited every evening at the shoreline, scanning the ocean for a boat that would bring his father home from war. The boy carved small figures in the sand to keep himself company. Every wave that touched the beach erased his companions, and every morning he built them again. Days turned to weeks, and the boy's hair grew longer, his eyes sadder, but he never stopped waiting. And then, one day, an unfamiliar boat arrived. "Enough!" Xylar interrupted sharply. Her voice carried the sting of dismissal. "We do not permit sentimentalism in preliminary trials. Save your anecdotal indulgences for primitive audiences." David stepped back, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. He hadn't even gotten to the part where the boy realizes the man in the boat isn't his father, but a messenger carrying the final letter he ever wrote. He looked around, hoping at least one student had felt something, but all he saw were bored expressions, flashing lenses, and digital note-taking resumes already in progress. Xylar's suit whirred as she floated upward. Human storytelling relies too heavily on emotionality without structural cohesion. You present a linear narrative with no cultural scaffolding, no multi-dimensional resonance. I have seen better performances from neural shells in training simulations. There were no grades given that day, but the message was clear. David was not welcome, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his form of storytelling, soaked in memory, emotion, and simplicity, was alien to them. The others built stories like architecture, modular, layered, engineered to evoke calibrated responses. But he built his stories like fires, hoping someone would come sit beside them. After class, David sat alone at the edge of the learning dome, looking out at the purple, glowing plains of Verexis Prime. A pair of twin moons hovered low in the sky. He pulled out his pad and stared at the unfinished story. He thought about deleting it, starting over, mimicking the mechanical brilliance of his classmates. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather's voice. Or maybe it was the boy in the story, who had kept building those fragile figures in the sand, despite knowing the waves would always take them. If there was one thing David had learned about humans, it was this. They did not create stories to win competitions. They created them to remember, to feel, and sometimes to heal. That night, David didn't change his story. He simply decided to tell it better next time. The real challenge hadn't been issued yet, but it was coming. David arrived early to the rotunda the next cycle, determined not to let yesterday define his place in the academy. The sky outside was still cast in lavender hues, and the lecture dome had not yet begun its levitation shift to the upper tiers. He entered the amphitheater in silence, choosing a seat near the back where he could observe without being noticed. No one greeted him. No one acknowledged his presence. The class was already beginning to form its own gravitational pull around students with reputations, species pedigrees, or simply louder voices. He had none of those. The seats filled quickly, and Professor Xylar descended into the central platform in a spiraling beam of soft blue light. Without delay, she gestured toward the presentation field, her mechanical limbs clicking with cold elegance. Today begins the demonstration sequence. Each of you will present a model narrative. Your performance will be recorded and scored based on cognitive stimulation, resonance range, and cultural complexity. We begin alphabetically. The first presenter, a translucent being from the Nebari collective named Vies, stepped forward. She glided rather than walked, a phosphorescent ripple trailing behind her. When she began her story, the entire dome changed. Holographic overlays ignited in layers, projecting a living tapestry of color, scent, and vibration. The scene was a Nebari dream hunt, told through shifting fractal patterns that synchronized with a rhythm only Nebari minds could fully grasp. The alien symbols unfurled into sequences that bent in ways David's human perception struggled to follow. The class watched in rapt silence, their neural translators humming at full capacity. When Vess finished, Professor Xylar nodded without expression and simply stated, "Accepted. Resonance index, 84%. David didn't know what that meant, but he clapped politely. No one else did. It wasn't part of the etiquette here. One by one, the students took their place at the center, each performance more elaborate than the last. A draconian species named Quarn delivered a battle epic in 10 simultaneous voices, each recounting the story from a different temporal perspective. An aquatic species named Rilu used a fluid tank and subsonic harmonics to paint her tale directly into the minds of the audience, evoking ancestral grief from creatures with no physical memory. A synthetic intelligence named Oryx emulated a myth from the planet where his server cluster had gained consciousness. His story unfolded like a chess game played on 10,000 boards at once, each move a word, each checkmate a revelation. The metrics were always cited afterward. Resonance index, 91%, cognitive stimulus peak, 118 pulses per second, emotive response, sector-specific. David couldn't keep up. He felt as if he were auditing lectures from a civilization thousands of years more advanced in narrative form. Even the students who sat quietly yesterday now shone like stars, shifting their bodies, modulating their tones, interfacing directly with the sensory nodes embedded throughout the chamber. It wasn't just storytelling here, it was engineering, theater, psychology, and neurological design rolled into one. When a species called the Felixen presented, the air pressure in the dome subtly altered. David noticed his heartbeat quicken and his skin prickle. The story was abstract, no characters, no setting, only a series of sensations that evoked emotions he didn't know how to name. When it ended, Professor Zylar simply said, "Exemplary." No score was given. The rest of the students murmured with approval. David sat frozen in his seat, unsure if what he had felt was awe or despair. His story from the previous day, an Earthchild, a wooden boat, a distant horizon, felt like a grain of sand compared to the galaxies being conjured around him. Yet something within him remained unmoved by all the glittering brilliance. He tried to isolate what he was feeling and realized it was hollowness. For all their complexity, the stories left no lingering heartbeat, no questions, no ache. As the final student approached, David noticed her immediately. She was a member of a winged species called the Arillari, tall, graceful, with eyes like polished stone. Her name was Lysera. She hadn't spoken to anyone during the first lecture, nor participated in the whispering dismissals directed at him. Now she stepped into the platform, wings tucked, a circular device attached to her wrist. With a single motion, she activated it. The room turned into a starlit forest. Massive trees shimmered with bioluminescent fruit, while ghostly creatures moved in patterns that suggested both ritual and randomness. Her voice flowed like liquid silver, telling a tale of a tribe that sang its young into existence, each birth a shared melody passed down and transformed. The visuals were breathtaking, but her voice was the anchor. It carried the weight of tradition, the tempo of longing, and the melody of memory. Even David, who was no fan of simulations, felt something stir in his chest. When she ended, the silence was absolute. Then came the metrics. Resonance index 96%. Full spectrum transmission. Emotional dilation range confirmed. Professor Zylar inclined her head, more acknowledgement than she had given anyone else. An admirable progression, Lysera. You've internalized harmonic storytelling techniques beyond the Arillari norm. See me after class for advanced calibration protocol. Lysera simply bowed and returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. David exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. It was over. The demonstration phase had concluded. Zylar turned her optics toward the seating tiers. Each of you has illustrated your cultural affinity for structural resonance. The next phase will challenge you to construct a narrative that can cross those boundaries. Your audience will not share your biology, your history, or your logic. You will be evaluated on your ability to evoke authentic response from a panel of mismatched species. There was a pause. Then she added with subtle emphasis, including our resident human. David's spine stiffened. Every head in the room turned toward him. You will be the baseline subject for emotional accessibility. Your readings will determine the narrative's success in crossing cultural thresholds. David wanted to disappear, but he knew this wasn't an accident. Zylar was testing him again, but this time with science, she continued. You will each receive your feedback packages by end of cycle. Dismissed. The students filed out, murmuring in low tones. David gathered his pad and rose, but before he could leave, Lysera approached him. She stood silently for a moment, her wings folded neatly behind her. Then she spoke, her voice softer in conversation than in performance. You didn't deserve what happened yesterday. David blinked. I didn't expect anyone to say that. Most wouldn't, she said. But most here have forgotten what stories are for. He studied her face. She wasn't mocking him. Her tone wasn't patronizing. She meant it. You were watching the others just now, she said. What did you feel? David hesitated. Admiration, confusion, but not much else. Lysera nodded slowly. That's the problem. Before he could respond, she turned and left, leaving him standing there with questions blooming in his chest. Not about her, but about what came next. As he stepped out into the corridor of shifting glass and humming walls, he felt something different than the day before. It wasn't hope, not quite. But it was a glimmer, like the first spark that lives before a story is born. David left the corridor behind, stepping into the Academy's outer gardens, where crystalline trees arched toward a violet sky. The ambient hum of the complex faded into the distance as he found a secluded bench near a glistening pool of liquid light. He needed the silence. His mind churned with thoughts he couldn't easily articulate, not even to himself. Lysera's words echoed louder than anything else he had heard that day. Most here have forgotten what stories are for. He stared at the surface of the pool, watching how the reflections twisted with the slow wind. In his pocket, his datapad buzzed softly. The feedback package had arrived. For a moment he considered ignoring it. He knew it would be filled with sterile metrics and scores, numbers that dissected performance with no regard for the soul of the telling. But ignoring it would change nothing. With a resigned breath, he opened the file. As predicted, the analysis was brutal. His emotional amplification was deemed primitive and localized. His structural coherence was rated below acceptable standards. But buried deep within the pages of critiques was something else. A notation not written by any program. It was a simple line appended at the bottom of the file. Emotion, while statistically inefficient, remains a wildcard factor in cross-species resonance. Observation recommended. No name, no signature, just that. David closed the file and tucked the pad away. His chest felt strangely lighter, as if the burden of fitting into their system had finally cracked and fallen away. If he was to remain here, he would not win by becoming like them. He would have to be exactly what he was, unrefined, imperfect, human. The next cycles passed in a blur of preparation. The students were given 3 days to construct a new narrative for the cross-sections evaluation. The challenge was simple in theory: evoke an authentic emotional response from a diverse panel that included species with no common history, no mutual senses, and sometimes no overlapping emotional frameworks at all. For many students, this meant compiling complex sensory matrices, programming interactive sequences, and adjusting delivery algorithms to anticipate variant perception pathways. David had none of those tools. He had only a blank slate, a borrowed voice, and memories that pulsed in his chest like living things. He spent his days watching the others from a distance, studying how they layered technical precision into every moment of their presentations, but in the evenings he returned to the gardens, where the crystalline trees whispered in the warm winds, and he wrote. He wrote not with a strategy, but with memory. He thought about his grandfather, sitting by a crackling fire back on Earth, telling stories with a voice worn rough by time and tobacco. He thought about how those stories never needed holograms or synthetic harmonics to carve themselves into his young heart. A boy building a boat, a woman waiting at a railway station, a soldier carrying a letter stained with seawater and grief. These were the stories that mattered, not because they were grand or logical, but because they were true. David decided he would tell a story about loss, not heroic loss, but the small, invisible kind that everyone suffers quietly, the kind that shapes a life without anyone else noticing. He crafted a simple narrative about a girl on a distant colony who tended to the last flower on a dying world. He would not use holograms, he would not augment his voice. He would trust the listeners to meet him halfway. Or not. Either way, he would remain true to the human heart. The morning of the presentation arrived heavy with anticipation. The rotunda of expression floated at its highest point now, spinning slowly in the upper atmosphere where the light from the twin suns painted endless prismatic colors across its walls. The students filed into the amphitheater with their materials, most surrounded by assistants or sensory drones making last-minute calibrations. David entered alone, carrying nothing but himself. Professor Xylor hovered near the central platform, her exosuit gleaming with calculated authority. She gestured for the students to prepare themselves and explained the final parameters. Each student would have precisely 10 minutes. Each performance would be evaluated first by the observation panel, then by biometric scans measuring real-time emotional fluctuations in the audience. For the final measure, the human would be monitored separately, using old Earth-based standards of emotional resonance. When it was David's turn, he heard whispers ripple through the gathered students. Some barely concealed their amusement. Others watched with detached curiosity, as if observing an anomaly in a lab. He walked steadily to the center, feeling the smooth surface of the platform vibrate beneath his boots. He did not activate any projection fields. He did not request atmospheric adjustment. He stood before the assembly, placed his hand over his heart in the old Earth gesture of greeting, and began. There once was a girl who lived on a world no one remembered. His voice was steady, though the air around him seemed too vast, too silent. He spoke of a barren landscape of once great oceans now reduced to salt flats, of cities abandoned and crumbling under the weight of forgotten wars. In the midst of this decay, a single flower had bloomed, against all odds, against the will of entropy itself. The girl, no older than 15, found it growing between cracked stones near her ruined home. Every day, she brought it water, shielding it with her body during dust storms, speaking to it in the lonely hours of twilight. David painted the picture not with technology, but with careful, aching words. He described the roughness of the soil beneath her fingers, the way the light hit the broken buildings at sunset, the fragile tremble of petals in the poisoned wind. As he spoke, he saw some faces in the crowd shifting subtly, not in programmed reaction, but in discomfort, in feeling. He continued, "The girl grew older. Seasons passed. Friends left. Hope drained from the air like moisture from the ground. But still she tended the flower. It became a ritual, then a promise, then a sacred duty. When she grew too weak to walk, she crawled to it. When her eyes dimmed, she whispered to it, telling it stories of the ocean she had never seen but had once been told about. And when the day finally came that the girl did not rise, the flower remained. The last living thing in a world that had forgotten how to care for anything at all." David ended the story not with triumph, but with silence. He bowed his head briefly and stepped back. No lights flared. No simulations dazzled. The platform remained cold and empty, save for the lingering echo of his voice. For a long moment, the room remained utterly still. Then the biometric readings began to flash across the evaluation screens. Minor, irregular, unexpected. Professor Zylar's face betrayed no emotion, but David noticed her optical sensors narrowing slightly. He turned his gaze to the observation panel. Several of the panelists were visibly unsettled. A Ventari elder blinked rapidly, his skin color flickering in ways that suggested emotional disturbance. A Phylaxan representative had closed his 3 ocular apertures entirely. Most telling of all, the usually stoic Rilu Aquatic had lowered her head, ripples moving across her translucent surface in patterns that David had learned indicated sadness. Professor Zylar's voice cut through the heavy air. "Evaluation pending," she said formally. David did not smile. He did not bow again. He simply walked off the platform, heart pounding, leaving the shimmering emptiness behind him. As he returned to his seat, he passed Lacera, who watched him with those unreadable stone-polished eyes. She said nothing, but as he brushed past, he thought he saw her wings quiver slightly, as if catching a breeze only she could feel. For the first time since arriving at the academy, David allowed himself a small, private hope. Something had shifted, and he had felt it. David sat in the near silence of the amphitheater, feeling the air thicken with an invisible weight. Around him, something subtle and profound unfolded, too delicate for the grand instruments that monitored pulse and breath to quantify properly. It began as a ripple, not in the shimmering overlays or calculated gestures of the Academy's storytelling elite, but within the unseen spaces between hearts and minds. Professor Zylar floated still at her station, her exosuit gleaming under the fractured rays of the twin suns. But her posture was tense in a way David had never seen before. Her optics shifted rapidly across the gathered audience, parsing the anomalies, flooding the biometric readouts in front of her. Emotional resonance spikes were appearing where none should exist, in species long considered impervious to human-steel sentimentality. The Ventari elder, who moments ago maintained a perfect composure, now gripped the edge of his seat, the faint trembling of his long fingers betraying a loss of control. His ceremonial robes, usually pulsing with serene blue light, flickered erratically between hues of sorrow and longing. Beside him, the Phylaxan ambassador had frozen completely, a state known among his people to signify emotional overwhelm, a condition so rare that many considered it theoretical. Even among the students, cracks appeared in the polished surfaces of their academic detachment. Vess, the Nabari who had earlier woven a flawless fractal dreamscape, lowered her luminous eyes and pressed one hand to her chest. A low hum escaped her, unintentional and raw, vibrating with the timbre of regret. Visera, sitting nearest to the observation platform, remained still, but the steady twitch of her wings revealed more than words could have. Her gaze never left David, as though trying to reconcile what her training insisted could not be possible with what her heart now knew was undeniable. David kept his hands folded tightly in his lap, refusing to glance around, refusing to react. Inside, his heart pounded against his ribs like a desperate drum. He had not come here to conquer. He had come here to be heard. And now, impossibly, he was. Professor Xylar spoke finally, her voice modulated to a clinical neutrality that fooled no one attentive enough to hear the faint distortion threading through it. The human's performance has produced anomalous emotional readings beyond predictive models. Analysis protocols are now engaged. The massive holoscreens above the chamber burst into cascading layers of data. Color-coded graphs, pulsating matrices, sensory waveforms. No one cared. No one was watching. All eyes, all minds, all fractured hearts were still tethered to the lingering echo of a simple story told without artifice. A senior student, Oryx, the synthetic intelligence who had once commanded an entire mythos in a 10,000-branch simulation, rose to speak. His voice, normally a precise mechanical monotone, now contained an irregular modulation, like static creeping into a pristine signal. "I propose immediate recalibration of evaluation criteria," Oryx said, his optics flickering between shades of amber and green. The current parameters failed to anticipate organic resonance achieved through non-structured narrative input. Xylar turned sharply toward him. "The parameters are sufficient," Oryx's servo joints clicked in agitation. Sufficient for quantification, perhaps, but not for comprehension. David could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The Academy prided itself on its imperviousness to emotional disruption, yet now it teetered on the brink of admitting that something unmeasured had power here. A low murmur rolled through the students. Some nodded in agreement with Oryx. Others folded their arms defensively, refusing to yield to the intangible. Factions formed, not along species lines, but along an invisible divide between those willing to embrace the unknown and those terrified of losing their certainties. Professor Xylar activated her personal resonance field, projecting a sphere of stabilizing influence over the immediate platform. Her exosuit glowed brighter, almost aggressively. "This institution," she announced, "does not reward sentimental artifacts. We cultivate mastery of structure, innovation of form, precision of resonance. One aberration does not alter the foundations of our art." David felt the sting of her words, not because they were aimed at him, but because he saw in her the same fear that others hid less well. Fear not of him, not even of humanity, but of something far older, of vulnerability itself. Belystra stood slowly, her wings half unfurling in a silent gesture of objection. Her voice rang clear across the chamber, steady despite the tremor in her shoulders. "Mastery without heart is hollow." The words sliced through the sterile air like a blade. A few gasps followed. David saw several students shift uncomfortably. Lysera was respected. For her to oppose Xylar so openly was unthinkable. The professor's gaze locked onto her. "Emotion clouds judgment." The series' reply came without hesitation. "Emotion gives judgment meaning." The tension in the rotunda thickened to the point where the very walls seemed to lean inward, listening. Somewhere deep in the Academy's internal monitoring systems, alarms must have been tripped. Emotional contagion protocols, perhaps. But no interventions came. No authority dared interrupt what was unfolding. David rose, not to defend himself, but because he felt called to speak. Every part of him screamed to stay silent, to avoid drawing further wrath. But something stronger, something rooted deeper than fear, propelled him forward. He stepped back onto the platform, standing within the edge of Xylar's resonance field. It buzzed against his skin like static, trying to push him away. He fought it. "I did not come here to undermine your traditions," he said, his voice steady but low. "I came because stories matter. Not because they win awards, not because they achieve structural perfection, but because they remind us that we are alive." He turned slowly, addressing not just the professor but the entire gathered assembly. "We can simulate any sensation, we can engineer any experience, but if we forget how to feel, truly feel, then all our brilliance is just dust on glass." Silence met his words. Not the silence of indifference, but the charged, living silence of an audience holding its breath. Professor Xylar's field retracted slightly, its glow dimming. She regarded David for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned away, her voice carrying a new, barely perceptible edge of exhaustion. Dismissed. The students rose slowly, as if waking from a collective dream. Some filed out quickly, eager to escape the emotional gravity of the moment. Others lingered, exchanging glances laden with unspoken questions. Lysera approached David as the rotunda emptied, her wings brushing the air softly behind her. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside him, sharing the heavy quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "You changed something today?" David shook his head. "I didn't mean to." She smiled faintly, a rare, genuine expression. "All the more reason it matters." Together they walked out of the rotunda, leaving behind the shattered symmetry of a world that had, for a few fragile moments, remembered how to bleed, how to ache, how to live. Far above them, the twin suns of Virexis Prime burned with a brilliance that no simulation could replicate, a brilliance born not from perfection, but from the violent, beautiful chaos of real life. And for the first time since his arrival, David felt he belonged. Not because he had conformed, but because he had endured. David and Lysera walked side by side through the vast crystalline gardens that circled the upper tiers of the Galactic Academy. The soft twilight of Virexis Prime stretched endlessly around them, bathing the delicate structures and flowering bioluminescent plants in a quiet, almost sacred glow. Neither spoke at first, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the silence of understanding, of shared rebellion against a world that demanded perfection at the cost of humanity. When David finally glanced at Lysera, he saw a subtle shift in her demeanor. The rigid discipline she once wore like armor had softened, revealing a deeper, more natural poise. She looked ahead, her wings trailing like silver banners in the breeze, her hands loosely clasped behind her back. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice low. She considered for a moment before answering. "Now, the Academy must decide whether it will evolve or petrify." She turned to face him fully. "You showed them a door they did not know existed. Whether they step through it is no longer your burden to carry." David absorbed her words, feeling a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. He had always known that change was slow and often thankless, but he had not come to Virexis Prime to spark revolutions. He had only come to tell the truth as he understood it. By the time they returned to the dormitory levels, a quiet buzz filled the common areas. Students gathered in clusters, whispering fervently, exchanging furtive glances. Some pointed at him when they thought he would not notice. Others looked away quickly when he caught their gaze. Not all the stares were hostile. Curiosity, uncertainty, even admiration flickered among them. Lysera touched his arm lightly. "You should prepare for what is coming." David nodded, though he did not know what preparation could possibly help him now. The following cycle, an official summons arrived. David reported to the Grand Forum, a chamber rarely used except for matters of institutional significance. He entered alone, his boots echoing against the polished obsidian floor. Above him, the Council of 10, the highest governing body of the Academy, sat in a semicircle of translucent thrones. Professor Xylar floated to the side, her glow dimmed, her presence strangely diminished. The central speaker, a being named Mayorix, whose form shimmered between states of matter, addressed him first. David Harper of Earth Modig said, his voice resonating in multiple frequencies simultaneously, "You stand before the Council not as a petitioner, but as a phenomenon we must address." David kept his posture straight, his hands steady at his sides. "The events of the past rotation have exposed deficiencies in our evaluative models," Mayorix continued. "Your presentation triggered cross-seques resonance anomalies, heretofore undocumented. Emotional impact was achieved without adherence to structural narrative protocols." Several other council members nodded, their expressions difficult to read across so many species. One, a crystalline entity named Valora, leaned forward. "We do not seek to diminish the accomplishments of our traditions," Valora said, her voice like a chorus of chimes. "However, it would be unwise to ignore the evidence before us." David waited, sensing the gravity of what was coming. Mayorix spoke again. "Therefore, by majority decision, the Council hereby mandates the establishment of a new course of study, parallel narrative systems, with you, David Harper, as its inaugural guide." The words hung in the air, too immense to immediately grasp. "You will not be a professor," Marix clarified, "but a resident specialist. You will document, demonstrate, and teach the principles of human storytelling to our students. Participation will be voluntary. Success will be measured by resonance, not structure." David felt the breath catch in his chest. A small, stubborn part of him had expected exile, not elevation. Yet here he was, not merely accepted, but charged with shaping something entirely new. He bowed deeply, an earth gesture, not customary here but instinctual. "I accept." The council members inclined their heads in acknowledgement. Formalities concluded quickly thereafter, and David was dismissed. Outside the grand forum, Lysera waited for him. When she saw his face, she smiled. Not the polite diplomatic smile of the academy, but a real one, full of warmth and pride. "What did they say?" she asked. "They want me to stay," David said, his voice still colored with disbelief. "They want me to teach." Lysera's eyes softened. "Then you have done more than tell a story. You have begun one." In the weeks that followed, change rippled through the academy like a stone thrown into a still pond. Students who once scorned David's simplicity now queued for his lectures. They listened, not with the analytical detachment they had once wielded like a shield, but with something closer to wonder. David's sessions were held in one of the smaller lecture halls, devoid of sensory enhancements. He insisted on it. Those who came learned not through simulations, but through raw language, through the fragile alchemy of shared memory and imagination. He spoke of earth myths, of fables and fireside tales, of heroes who failed and villains who wept, of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage. He encouraged his students to bring their own stories, not their engineered performances, but the ones whispered in secret places of their cultures, the ones that survived because they mattered, not because they were perfect. Lysera attended every lecture, sometimes offering insights, sometimes simply listening. Her presence became a quiet endorsement, a bridge between David's humanity and the Academy's storied traditions. Even Professor Xylar, though she never spoke during the sessions, occasionally appeared in the back rows, her exosuit darkened to minimize distraction. David noticed, but never called attention to her. He understood now that resistance was not always hatred. Sometimes it was simply fear of the unknown. As the cycles turned into seasons, the Academy changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. Metrics still mattered, structures were still revered. But alongside them grew a new respect for the untamed, the imperfect, the human. One evening, as David walked alone through the gardens, he found Lysera waiting by the pool of liquid light where he had once doubted his place. She stood barefoot, her wings casting long shadows across the shimmering surface. He approached, and for a long moment they said nothing, simply sharing the quiet. Then Lysera spoke, her voice filled with something deeper than gratitude. "Stories are seeds," she said. "You planted one here." David smiled, a slow, honest smile. "It will grow because of all of us." She tilted her head, studying him with those steady, stone-polished eyes. "No. It will grow because you remembered what others forgot." The twin moons rose behind her, casting a silver halo around her form. The light caught the surface of the pool, and for a fleeting second the entire world seemed suspended between memory and possibility. David closed his eyes briefly, feeling the pulse of the living, breathing universe around him. When he opened them again, he knew that he had not merely survived the Academy, he had changed it. Not by conquering it, not by overpowering it, but by reminding it of something ancient and vital. And somewhere deep within the fabric of Virexus Prime, within the hearts of students and professors alike, a new story had begun to take root. A story that would be told and retold long after the names of its first tellers had faded into the stars. The story of the human heart, the story of what it meant to feel, the story that no amount of brilliance could ever replace.